Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bad Bleeps of the Bible. No man in history conjures up the super visceral reaction as does our bleep this week. His name is synonymous with betrayal. I am sure when you hear it, you're going to think, oh yeah, betrayer. But as with many of our bleeps, maybe it's not fully his fault. Maybe there was something lurking just under the surface of his and our understanding that drove him to his actions. And maybe even his role and his actions were inevitable. And he was just part of a puzzle that was completely out of his control. After all, literally, the Bible tells us that he was possessed by the utmost of all evil, Satan. So then can we really blame our bleep for his actions that led to the murder of one of the most famous individuals in history? Maybe not, but in today's episode, we're going to discuss the history, the theories, and the story of betrayal by our infamous bleep, Judas Iscariot. Do you know how badly I want to play Lady Gaga's Judas? Can I be sued for that at the top of this informative section? Do you? Whatever. I'll also tell you before we begin, do know that I'm also going to rein in my musical theater nerd and try not to reference Jesus Christ Superstar and Godspell in all of this. But there are zero promises. I'm also going to tell you right now that I had such a fun time researching our bleep this week, Judas. There are so many theories and conjectures about this dude and his role in Jesus' death that you could truly spend hours sorting through it. I did. And I'm going to give you the Scotty version of what I was taught growing up in the church about Judas, and then what I discovered as I dug a little deeper. Finally, in the end, I'm going to tell you the story of his betrayal and his bloody, gory demise, and then again, theories around his actions. And I want you, listener, to determine whether you think Judas was just a pawn in the greater tale of the man and the legend that was Jesus, or if he was inherently evil. Let's see. So from the start, Judas is truly set apart from the rest of the apostles, and here's why. His name, as it has come to be known, is Judas Iscariot. And while there's no debate about the Judas part, which was actually a super popular name at the time and derived from Judah, which is equally as popular, and the name Judas was actually the name of one of Jesus's brothers. Yes, Mary had more babies other than Jesus, and one of them's name was Judas. Now, his surname, Judas's surname of Iscariot, is the hotly debated part of his name. And there are really two schools of thought for this. First, is it a surname? Is it a hometown? Or is it, as some believe, a corruption of the word Sicarius, referring to a dagger carried by Israeli terrorists that were known as the Sicarii, who sought to overthrow the government at the time? And while that is fabulous, and I would love to say, yes, Judas was a hidden assassin wanting to overthrow the government and needed to align with the most powerful man at the time, Jesus, I would rather go with the former of the theories, being that it's where he's from. So obviously, in ancient times, folks did not have surnames like we do today, seemingly random names like my last name. Instead, folks had names that indicated where they were from and who they were descended from, etc. So in Greek, the name Iscariot translates to a man from Kerioth, which Kerioth is a town that is found in Judea rather than in Galilee, which all of Christ's apostles, all of Jesus's apostles were from Galilee, and potentially only Judas being from Judea, which would separate him from, again, all of the other apostles who were all from Galilee. So this theory seems to hold the most weight amongst all the scholars that I read, though some did want to be like, oh yeah, no, he was an assassin. Regardless, both secular and religious people think that it's where he's from. still, it does set him apart, and it makes him a little different than those that were with Jesus at the time. So our Judas was obviously already different and set apart from the rest of the disciples. Why don't I say that about 300 more times? But the question is,
are people born wicked? Or do they have wickedness thrust upon them?
so we're going to dig through the annals of what we have recorded throughout the Bible to determine first his character, and then we're going to dig into what could be a case of demon possession by the most evil of evil itself, Satan. So let's see what we've got. First, we know that Judas was one of Jesus's 12 apostles. We know that he was different, but he was still one of them. The apostles, of course, were his closest confidants and the folks that followed Jesus throughout what is known in religious circles as his earthly ministry of magic. We don't have anything recorded regarding how he was called like we do for others apostles. Like, did they find him? Oh my goodness, I forget which apostles these were. I think it was James and John that were fishing at the time. And Jesus said, come be fishers of men with me. And they joined him. We don't know how Judas was called. But what we do know is that he was one of the apostles and an important member of the group. In fact, he was the group's treasurer, a fact that would then come to bite the apostles and Jesus in the end. So we know that money was important to Judas. I'm sure he volunteered for this position. But how important is the question? The Bible also reveals that as treasurer, Judas used this position for his own personal gain. In fact, his apostle bro John records that Judas, I'm quoting from the text here, was a thief and had the bag and bare what was put therein. So he was keeper of the coin, but also stole from the purse of the apostles and stole from Jesus. Strike one for Judas. And then in another section of this same portion of the Bible, we have the story account of Mary Magdalene, the former sex worker turned Jesus acolyte and perhaps lover. I don't know how to love him. Also, please watch the Sarah Bareilles version of that song from Jesus Christ Superstar. And even Sporty Spice's version is also really good. I have digressed. Judas is a thief, and when Mary Magdalene, sex worker turned acolyte, came to wash Jesus's feet with her hair and some very expensive oil, Judas objected. He said, "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor?" And he also asked, "It's worth a year's wages. Why not just do that with it instead and give it to us so we can give it to the poor?" Clearly, Judas was not going to give this money to the poor, or maybe he wasn't going to give all of this money. He was coveting his cut from the expensive oil and sad that he wasn't able to receive said cut because Mary Magdalene used it to wash her hair on Jesus's feet. How do we know this, though? Because again, John records that he did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because, and I quote, he was a thief. He fully intended to take those funds from the bag. Strike two. Finally, strike three. Speaking of Sporty Spice, look at me with these sports references. But strike three comes in the form of the ultimate betrayal of Jesus, which led to both Jesus' death and the death of Judas. And with this last strike, this betrayal, we're going to flip how we're telling the story. So I've been very much informative, and I'm going to tell you this in a narrative style to like switch it up a wee bit. So settle in and relax. Once in the ancient city of Jerusalem, a man named Judas Iscariot found himself caught between the allure of power and the pull of loyalty. Judas was not always known as the infamous betrayer, but rather he was once a hopeful disciple of a charismatic teacher, Jesus of Nazareth. Judas was a man of complex motives. He was drawn to Jesus by the promise of a new kingdom, one that would free the Jewish people from the Roman oppression. And like other disciples, he had seen Jesus perform miracles. He saw Jesus heal the sick and speak with an authority that really did seem divine and seemed to come from above. But as the days passed, it seemed that Judas began to grow disillusioned. He, like many others, had misunderstood the nature of Jesus' mission, why he was there. Jesus spoke of love, of forgiveness, and of spiritual redemption rather than earthly conquests and power. And this discrepancy gnawed at Judas. He wanted a more radical transformation. He wanted an overthrow. And not receiving that, Judas began to cheat, to steal, and to lie. Until finally, Judas's deception led to something much more deep and much more malicious. One evening, Judas found himself deep in thought, contemplating his next move, maybe contemplating what he'll steal next. The religious authorities at the time were growing increasingly hostile toward Jesus. We should mention the religious authorities in the pocket of the Roman authorities were growing hostile toward Jesus, viewing him as a threat to both their authority and the authority of Roman rule. Judas's ambition and his frustration led him to a fateful decision that would ultimately result in his death, the death of his friends, and the person that he followed and believed in. He made the decision to betray Jesus. But was it really his decision? The Bible tells us that while in the upper room of a home in Jerusalem, Jesus and his disciples engaged in the iconic and unknown to them Last Supper, which, if you ever have the chance, this is a side note, we're going to pull back from the story, which if you have ever had the chance to visit the painting located in the Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan, do it. I was so surprised at not only how big it was, but also how unassuming its location is. And did you know that it was bombed? I didn't. Anywho, in that upper room, the 12 disciples were sitting around together when the Bible tells us that then Satan entered into Judas called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. And this is corroborated by another apostle who also wrote that during supper, when the devil had put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. And just to confirm that when it's referenced Satan entered into Judas Iscariot, I called my dad. Whether he, as a pastor, believed that Judas was possessed by the devil, or whether this was more allegorical and that he was feeling like Satan influenced him rather than possessed him. And I'm going to quote what he told me, and I'm reading it from my phone, that, and I quote, "The golden rule of the Bible interpretation is to take each word in its literal, ordinary meaning/sense, unless the context of the text dictates clearly otherwise." Can you tell that he's a pastor? And Dad said that he would do a deep study on the two words entered in. So, as he says, Judas is then mysteriously possessed. End quote. So my dad fully believes that the devil yeeted himself into Judas. Regardless, Judas at this point knew that he was going to betray Jesus. And for his part, Jesus in that upper room also knew and said to the group as they were about to tuck into their delicious bread and food, he said, "Truly I say to you that one of you will betray me." And all the disciples went around saying, "Is it me? Is it me, Jesus?" Including Judas, who after saying the words promptly leaves the supper on some business. We know then that his business was betrayal, since after leaving that upper room, he sought out the chief of the priests and the elders and proposed a plan. The Bible tells us that then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. Do remember that 30 pieces of silver, because that's going to come back later. And it was finally later on that he discovered the perfect moment. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas arrived with a group of soldiers and the religious elders, armed with torches and with weapons. There, he identified Jesus with a kiss, the signal that he had agreed upon with the elders. And Chaos absolutely ensued as one of Jesus' disciples, Peter, known for a temper, drew his sword and cut off the high priest's servant ear. Jesus, however, very much admonished the use of violence and surrendered to the authorities, but not after placing the ear back on the soldier who had it removed and healing him. As Jesus was taken into custody, we can see Judas standing just on the outside and being struck by the gravity of his actions. He knew what he had done and what the consequences would be. And the hope that Judas had clung to had vanished and was replaced by a profound sense of betrayal. Not only betrayal toward Jesus, but also toward himself. And in his anguish, Judas runs to the temple of the elders and throws the 30 pieces of silver to the ground, screaming to the elders, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." The religious authorities, though, callously dismissed Judas's remorse, dismissing it as his own burden to bear. And with the silver back in his hand, Judas felt the weight of not only the silver, but the weight of his choices. Ooh. I love what I just did there. The path he had chosen had led to the capture of the man he had followed with hope, with admiration, and a desire for transformation and revolt. Overwhelmed by guilt, by his remorse, and by despair, Judas sought solitude. He wanted to be alone. He walked away from the city to a desolate place where he could no longer hear the echoes of betrayal. He walked to a remote field he had purchased with those 30 pieces of silver. Blood money. And there, in that somber moment, he made a choice that would forever mark his place in history. Judas Iscariot, the man who had aspired to change the world, ended his own life. And there are two accounts of this, one more bloody than the other. The first comes from Matthew, where Matthew wrote, "He departed and he went and hanged himself." The second and more gory of the two versions comes from the book of Acts in the New Testament, where Luke, again, one of the apostles, writes, and I'm quoting, "Now this man purchased a field with the reward of iniquity, and falling headlong, he burst asunder in the midst, and all his bowels gushed out. And it was known unto all the dwellers at Jerusalem, insomuch as that field is called in their tongue Akeldama, that is to say, the field of blood." To close, I'm returning to my original question posed in the form of the musical Wicked.
Are people born wicked? Or do they have wickedness thrust upon them?
With Judas, I feel like it's a complicated answer. So he certainly cheated, he definitely deceived, and he lied in his lifetime, all before his supposed possession by Satan himself. But the question is, was all of this preordained in order to fulfill his greater role in Jesus' ultimate betrayal and then, if you believe it, his resurrection? Early in the Old Testament, written thousands of years, supposedly, before the birth and death of Jesus, the prophet Zechariah predicted Jesus would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. And in Psalm 41:9, David wrote that Jesus' betrayer would share his bread, which Jesus does ultimately do in John 13. So really, if it was pre-planned, can Judas be blamed? Or have we had it all wrong this whole time? Since in 2006, the National Geographic Society announced the discovery as well as the new translation of a long-lost text known as the Gospel of Judas. This text was originally written in 150 CE, or just 150, and it was copied and translated a short time later in the 3rd century by a group known as Gnostics, a mostly Christian group that were denounced as heretics for their more open and liberal view of Christianity. Maybe some could say more honest view of Christianity. And in this Gospel of Judas, again, written only a short 100 years after the death of Jesus, Judas is actually glorified as Jesus' most favored disciple. And in this version, Jesus asked Judas to betray him to the authorities so that he could be freed from his physical body and then fulfill his ultimate destiny of saving humanity. Who knows? Do we take this text as just fan fiction, or could it be real? What we certainly know is this. Without Judas, we don't have the dude Jesus as he is known today. Rather, Jesus would be just another zealot relegated to history rather than worshipped throughout history. As a fellow named Robert Cargill, the assistant professor of classics and religious studies at the University of Iowa, states, the truth is, we don't know why Judas did what he did. The grand irony, of course, is that without Judas's betrayal, Jesus doesn't get handed over to the Romans and crucified. Without Judas, you don't have the central component of Christianity. You don't have the resurrection. And it turns out that our incredible bleep Judas may be just as important as Jesus in the eyes of history. It follows then that rather than vilifying the dude, let's be fascinated by him for the incredible person that he is. I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode. Please feel free to get in touch with me and share your thoughts and church stories at badbleepsofthebible@gmail.com. And you can find us on Instagram and TikTok at badbleepsofthebible. Sources for today's story can be found in our show notes, and please rate, review, and subscribe. Catch you next time, and watch out for betrayers with 30 silver coins. Amen, and bye-bye.